Hello artists! Welcome to art class. I'm Deanna and I'm here to inspire the artist in you to come out to play. This is episode 4 and the final class in our quick sketch series. Let's start with a discussion on creativity. And your challenge for the next couple of weeks is to experiment with creative ways to create and incorporate quick sketching. Creativity is one of those labels, like artist, that gets stuck on people. And so does uncreative. Experiences happen in people's lives, often when they're young, that define who they think they are. Let me remind you that an artist is someone who creates art. It's something that you do, rather than who you are. And a creative person is someone who practices creativity. It's not something that you're just born with. Creativity is a skill, and skills can be learned. Sometimes people learn skills on their own, but with help, everyone is capable of learning the skills of creativity. Artists, teachers, chefs, business people, scientists, architects, engineers, parents, and so forth are all better at what they do if they practice creativity. How can you be more creative as an artist, as someone who creates art? I suggest first, define a space dedicated to being creative. It does not have to be a fully functioning art studio. I use a spare bedroom of my house completely dedicated to artwork, but it can be just a corner of a room. And if you can't spare that, you could have just a box that's completely dedicated to your artwork and your supplies that you put away when you need the space for other things. In that case, your brain gets the signal, whenever the box comes out, that it's time to be creative. Whatever the size of your dedicated space, hold it with respect and keep it tidy and organized so there's no clutter keeping you from enjoying it. Secondly, put yourself into the path of creativity. Surround yourself with creative people and things, either in real life or online. As a visual artist, I have really enjoyed being around other artists, absorbing what they're doing and also how they're doing it. Open your eyes to see what's creative around you. While you're looking for the perfect Instagram photo, realize that anything and anyone in the environment around you can be cropped or composed just right to be interesting. The website behance.net is used by visual artists to organize and showcase their work. It's a fabulous place to expose yourself to the creativity of others. Scroll through whatever subject or media you're interested in and feel yourself becoming inspired. I love to read books and listen to podcasts on the subject of creativity. But some of my most favorite ones don't talk about creativity, they are creative. Perhaps you watched the competition TV show Chopped. The chefs are given a basket of ingredients and they're required to use their skills and be creative under tight time constraints to make food that impresses the judges. On a podcast called Song Salad, a random topic and a random music genre are selected. The writers do research and then combine the two into a short song. The results are often crazy and silly, but they follow a method and it's really fun to hear their work in progress. Creative people stand on the shoulders of other creative people. How else can you be more creative? See creativity as a process. Creativity is problem solving. Sometimes great ideas can just pop into our heads, but we can cultivate creativity. There's a science to the process, and there are people who study and specialize in the creative process in order to maximize our potential to create. A creative process will first define the task at hand, then brainstorm, work the ideas, put the best ideas into action, and make a finished product of some sort. It isn't enough to wait for ideas. A process can generate ideas, and it isn't enough to generate ideas. Something must be done about them. Aim for many ideas, at least 25, and then play with those ideas. Combine ideas that don't typically go together. Push the edges of what you're familiar with. Push yourself out of your comfort zone and take some risks. Bring ideas to the drawing board and start to organize them, sorting out the ones that could lead into an interesting direction. Look closely at the other ideas too, even if they seem crazy and unrealistic, because they could ignite ideas elsewhere. When you set aside time and discipline to work through a process, you're guaranteed to be creative. Somewhere along the way in the creative process, you're likely to feel a little uncomfortable, but that's not a sign that you should stop. Just like your lungs expand and contract as you breathe, the creative process expands and contracts. Here's a great visual that I stole from a fun little book titled Steal Like an Artist, written by Austin Kleon. Notice the footnote where he credits stealing this from his friend Maureen. In this visual, The Life of a Project, you can see great ideas start on a high note with lots of enthusiasm. As the work progresses, it tends to become a bit difficult, and sometimes it gets a little boring. The creative person can easily get lost in what's called the dark night of the soul, and perhaps completely abandon the project. But those who stay with it can see things starting to come together, and they finish it even though it may not have turned out as well as they initially hoped. I've known artists who take this expand and contract process personally and seriously, and they fall into a story of being tortured by their artwork. If you relate, I suggest you stop that. You don't need to be tortured. Understand discomfort is part of the process, but you're not required to suffer. Elizabeth Gilbert, the woman who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, also wrote a book that is a true gift to all creative people. It's titled Big Magic. Please give yourself the gift of creative freedom and read Big Magic. I like to listen to the Audible version that the author reads in her own voice, and I listen to it at least once a year. There's so much more I could say about being creative, but this is a good time to get right into some artwork. I'll show you a few new ways to create quick sketches so you have some more tools for creativity. Let's go to the drawing board. Instead of just filling up a sketchbook and then putting it on the shelf, never to be looked at again, consider making a quick sketch diary. Fill up a page a day and date each page, and write captions about the sketches and the day, and let it be a journal of the artistic sorts. Journals are always interesting for me to look at later. The other day I was looking through one of my sketch journals and I found the day that I had gotten my very first iPhone. In episodes 1 and 3, I showed you how to use graphite to create quick sketches, but you could also use markers, watercolors, ink washes, colored pencils, or you could experiment digitally. You can experiment by mixing mediums. Here's some different examples of works that I've completed in alternate mediums. So here's a cat that I started off with graphite, and if you look closely you can see where I drew the basic shapes, then I drew the contour, and then I did a little bit of darks with the graphite. But then I stopped there and I grabbed my watercolors, and this is on paper that's heavy enough to hold water, so it worked out just fine. This is almost a watercolor paper, but not quite. So I started with the very, very lightest tones first and let them set into the paper a little bit. And then I came back in again with some darker tones. And then finally, before I was finished, I came back in again one more time with the graphite and I put in the darkest darks and added a little bit of definition. This I think I spent about maybe 5 minutes on. Here's another image. I started off with graphite here and I did the very basic shapes first, then I did the contours, and then instead of doing any shading, I went to some acrylic paint and I thinned the acrylic paint. This was black acrylic paint. I thinned it down really thin and I did all the very lightest lights first. The paper absorbed it really quickly and I was able to go back in very soon after and put in these darkest darks. And within just a couple of minutes, I have a complete image. Here's an example where I started off with graphite, but then instead of drawing the contour with graphite, I grabbed a pen. This is just a regular writing pen, but it is water fast, so when I did the washes on top of it, the pen didn't bleed. You could use Sharpie too, but in this case, I wanted to use something much skinnier. So then I used my watercolors and I put in just 3 tones, this greenish color in the background, brown on the cow, and as soon as that was set into the paper enough, and by the way, this was not even watercolor paper, it's just Bristol vellum, then I put in these shadows and it just made the image pop a little bit. So here's an example where I use this pen again. I started off with the graphite. I can see my pencil lines where I drew the basic shapes first, and then I drew the contour. Now this little critter has really fuzzy fur, and so the contour was quite a bit broken up around here. But I did some of the darkest darks with the pen, as you can see in the eyes, the nose, and in this area. And then I grabbed some pastels, and within only just about 10 seconds, I looked at the photograph and saw the most predominant colors, and I just blocked those in and then smeared it with my finger. In about 10 seconds, the color was already laid in. Here's where I started off with colored pencils. I didn't use any graphite on this at all, but I did draw the basic shapes first with the colored pencils as lightly as I could, and then I went right into the contour with a color, by the way. Whatever the predominant color was what I started with. And then whatever colors popped out in the photograph, I just started laying those in with the colored pencils. Here's another example of the same medium. I started off with a very light colored pencil, did the contour, and then I used some color to block in all this background and the color that popped out into my eyes from the photograph. In this one, I used a stump to blend, like we do when we're doing a graphite sketch. But the stump couldn't really move the colored pencil around on the paper very much, so it didn't work that great, but I was experimenting, and so it was fine. So I encourage you to use traditional art mediums like the ones that I showed you here, and also try some non-traditional art mediums. I don't know what those are, but if you just open up your mind and see what else you could do these sketches with, just remember, keep them quick and keep moving, and try not to get lost in the coloring part. Remember, these are still quick sketches. It's time to be creative and to use quick sketches in a new way. I've mentioned before that I love to sketch birds, and I have a precious little bird's nest that was abandoned on my front porch. It still has the little eggs in it. The eggs were not kept warm, and so the unhatched chicks did not survive. I carefully brought the nest inside, and now it's sitting on a bookshelf in my living room. I want to create a small piece of art to hang above the bird's nest. I have a lot of very large and colorful art in my home, but I want some smaller art that holds its own attention when someone takes the time to look. It's a multi-dimensional way of decorating. A piece of art to accompany this bird's nest is the perfect project for quick sketching and to be consciously creative. So I defined the parameters of the project or the problem. Small art to complement the bird's nest using quick sketches. Let's go back to the drawing board and put the creative process into motion. I'll put it in fast forward so you can see the time lapse, starting with a brainstorm and ending with the finished art. I started off putting my mission statement at the top of my workspace to help me stay on target, and I wrote down every single idea, no matter how silly it was, on its own little post-it note. Then I sorted through the post-it notes and put the ones that I thought were usable in one pile, some that were okay in another pile, and the ones that were kind of ridiculous in another. Then I looked through the ones that were usable and I created a plan. So the final ideas included a photograph for reference of a bird with some chicks in a nest, some colored textured paper that I was going to tear up and use like a collage, paste it with some glue, some pastel paints, I also had pastel pencils, some found items, string, tape, whatever, and bits of the bird's nest, including a little feather, and also some smudgy graphite. So I started by laying out some of the textured paper, and then I drew in the quick sketch. I used a graphite pencil, I did the basic shapes, the contour, and then I did some shading on the image. The camera went out of focus for a minute here, but it clears up. I had 4 little birds in that bird's nest, and it became a little bit too crowded. I didn't quite get my sketch right, and I never was able to really make those 4 little birds fit appropriately. They looked a little muddy in there to me, but I just kept going with it because you know how it is, sometimes there's some discomfort and things don't look quite right. Instead of abandoning the project, I just kept going. I felt a desire to include all of the fabulous color from the photograph that I had as my resource material. And so I added lots of pastel and just kept working it and working it and working it. And as I was building the collage, I still added more color. I picked up some sewing thread, a bunch of colors that were appropriate for this image, and cut up in tiny pieces and started gluing. I used tweezers so that I wouldn't get the glue and the string, the thread, stuck to my fingers. I also added in a little bit of tape and a feather that was in the bird's nest. The actual pieces of the bird's nest were quite appropriate for the texture that I was trying to build, so I carefully cut pieces and included it in the collage. I included some of the texture from the nest and the threads in the bird's beak to represent the worms. And then I just went back into the image with some pencils and sharpened up the details that needed to be clarified. So here's the finished piece under a piece of mat, and also I put it in a frame and hung it above the bird's nest. And it was fine, it was okay, I could have stopped here, but I knew I could do better, so I challenged myself to do the entire project again, back to the drawing board. I got out the same post-it notes and I rearranged them, sorted through them, and made some modifications and came up with a new plan. Now the new plan included more paper, more collage, and my goal was to be more free, less confined to the sketching and the pastel. And also I felt the pastel was maybe not a good choice because this image was so small and pastel can't get into those tiny crevices. So I switched to colored pencil. You can see I laid quite a bit more of the colored paper down before I started the drawing, but I did the drawing just the same, only this time I used a colored pencil, basic shape, contour, and then started to color in some of the darks and the lights and blocking in the color. I also chose to leave one of the little baby birds out. There were 4 in the original picture. I chose to only draw 3 to give myself a little bit more space, and also so that I could put more detail in those little birds. You know, the baby birds were pretty much just mouths, and they were kind of weird shaped, so you'd have to assume you knew what they were if that wasn't drawn very clearly. I spent some more time trying to clarify those little baby birds. I still felt that they were kind of muddy in there. They were sort of lost. And this time, there was so much more paper in this piece that the little birds really were lost. Overall, I feel that this image came together a little nicer than the previous one. The colored pencils helped me to get more detail in there. The birds seemed to pop a little bit more, even though there was a lot more of the collage that was so busy, and more string and other found objects, including that little feather. The second time around, I was able to keep the background more simple, and that looked better to me. I finished this image in the evening, and I went to bed feeling satisfied that I had done better the second time than I had the first. But in the morning, I noticed I still wasn't satisfied. It wasn't right. Back to the drawing board. I sorted through the post-it notes again and made some modifications to my plan. I wanted to create something more delicate, lighter in colors, and a little bit more like a quick sketch. I also changed my source material. I changed to a different bird, and this time there were no chicks. It was just a bird sitting on the edge of a nest. I started with white paper, and then I chose a colored pencil to do the quick sketch, and I did it just like a normal quick sketch. Basic shape, contour, and then I grabbed my watercolors and I put in some light washes and started building the color, but I kept it as loose as possible, and the leaves in the background were just suggestions of the background rather than actually coloring in the background. I still wanted the texture, so I used some of those found objects, string, a little bit of tape, and of course the pieces from the nest and that one little feather again. I sharpened up the image and used a tiny bit of white acrylic paint to put the white sparkle back in the bird's eye. I used a lot of restraint to keep from overworking this image, just brightened up the colors and tightened some of the details, and it was finished. So here's the final piece. It's finished, it's matted, it's framed, and I felt that I succeeded at what I set out to do. It's a delicate, quick sketch with some color, with some collage items, and my only regret is that the tail got clipped. But it looked great above the nest, and it looks great right next to the bold artwork that's in the same room. I was glad I persevered all the way through the end of the third piece. The third was much easier and more fun, but the first and second are perfect examples of the process being worked. In summary, we talked about creativity. Remember, creativity is a process that can be learned and practiced by everyone. Set aside a space to be creative and hold it with respect. Surround yourself with people and places that are creative. Learn a process to cultivate creativity and use it. While you're working on a project, know that you may get uncomfortable, but that's not a reason to abandon the project. Don't believe that you have to feel tortured in the process. Then take the skills and the tools that you already have and push the limits, even if it looks weird. Stay on target and finish the project. I'll be camping in Colorado for the next 2 weeks, and if I'm lucky, I won't have access to the internet. You'll have some extra time to work on being creative with quick sketches before our next class, and I look forward to seeing what you've done when I return. If you're watching this video in current time, May of 2019, you can click the bell below and you'll be notified when class resumes. Quick sketching is a fun, loose way to create images without taking your work too seriously, flaws and all. But when we meet again, we'll tighten the reins and practice what we call in the art world realism. Realism is representing a person, thing, or situation accurately or in a way that is true to life. We will use all of our graphite materials and a couple of new tools. If you enjoyed this class, remember to click the thumbs up below. And if you haven't already considered yourself an official student in art class, click the red subscribe button below and welcome. Subscribing is completely free for you, but ultimately it helps to support the production of this and future videos on this channel. Post comments or questions below, and if you're on Facebook or Instagram, follow me there and feel free to post images of the artwork you've done in this class. I would love to hear from you and to see your quick sketches. I'm Deanna. Have fun. See you next time in art class.